So when we talk about a culture of thinking, there are 8 cultural forces that really wind up being our levers for helping us to create that culture. And today we're going to talk about the cultural force of language. Of course, language is the prime vehicle of our instruction, but language operates on many, many subtle layers. And so to begin to kind of explore that today and how our language does really shape the culture, shapes a lot of our interactions with students as well. When I first began to kind of look at language, I drew on work from my colleagues at Project Zero, Shari Tishman and David Perkins, and they had done a lot of writing and looking at the language of thinking. Our Costa had also kind of done that. And the reason why focusing on the language of thinking had been important and continues to be important is in the English language, there's something to the magnitude of around 250,000 words in English. If you take the word thinking, it's the 125th most frequently used word in English. If you take thinking as a verb, the 12th most common verb. So anything that gets used with that kind of frequency, it's used because it has a really high utility value. And in fact, that it can be used in lots of different situations to mean lots of different things. So on one hand, that's great. On the other hand, that can create confusion, because what do we mean by it when we're saying that word, thinking? So I'd like for you to imagine that when you go in your classrooms today, you are not allowed to use the word think or thinking for the entire day. What is it that you could say instead? If you could just pair up with the person sitting next to you, and in the next 2 minutes, try to come up with as many alternatives as you can. If one of you could write those down, you can do them in your phone, do them in the book, the back of your page, whatever. You can form a group of 2 or 3, whoever is near you. And in the next 2 minutes, as many alternatives without any Googling, without any online stuff. Okay, if you would stop. Do a quick count of your words. So how many of you came up with at least 10 words? Okay. How many of you came up with over 15 words? How many 20 words? With that? Okay. Look at your list of words now and pick a word on your list that you think the pair sitting next to you did not come up with. Pick a word that you think was unique on your list that you think the pair sitting next to you did not come up with. Are there any pairs that came up with a word that you think no one else in the room came up with? I think you did. That was a pretty emphatic no. What word did you come up with?
We thought you did. We were interested in the fact that they're high school focus and ours primary focus.
Okay.
And their language is quite
So what was the word they came up with that you think that was extrapolate? Anyone else have that? Where's the extrapolate? Anyone else mention that they had a word that no one else came up with? Well, literally, when we do this, you only have 2 minutes. There are probably over 100 alternatives to the use of the word think and thinking. And the reason why a language of thinking can be really important is, in many instances, when we tell students, I want you to think, when you go back to your seat, think more about this, we're going to do some thinking today, they aren't clear exactly what we mean. And for many students, thinking and learning are just a process of memorization, and our research has shown that overwhelmingly, when you ask students about how they go about learning in school, they will give you techniques for memorizing material, but not for thinking about material. And so as teachers, when we use a more precise language, when we ask students to, I want you to form a conjecture, I want you to, we're going to be doing some generating of hypotheses today, we're going to be doing some predicting, then you are cueing the behaviors and the thinking that you are actually after. Most likely, just because of the way I framed this task, the words on your list were verbs. But when we talk about the language of thinking, for every verb there is a noun equivalent. So justifying, you've got a justification, hypothesizing, hypothesis. So when we think about a language of thinking, we've got both the products as well as the process there. So this is where we began, and in some early research that I did in classrooms, I found that the teachers that had a really rich culture of thinking in their classrooms, that were really good at supporting their students' development of their habits of mind and thinking dispositions, had a very rich but also a really precise language of thinking. So they were able to cue students in terms of what they were looking for from those students. But again, we saw very quickly, based on some research that I was doing with other colleagues at Harvard, as well as some other reading, that language operates in many, many different ways. So we began to kind of probe that, and the handout that you've got looks like this. And what I'm going to do is to kind of go through this, share with you a little bit of the background about where these ideas have come from, what the research is, what those look like in practice, why they're important, then give you a chance to kind of talk about that kind of with your colleagues, and then we'll come back together, and if we have time, we'll look at a video and begin to look at where do we see these language moves playing out in the classroom. So the first one to talk about is the language of noticing and naming. And this very much connects to what we just did in terms of language of thinking. And you had mentioned that you all were primary teachers versus secondary teachers, and even from a very young age, a key way that we teach a language of thinking is not by giving students a list of vocabulary words, but we do that as adults. A young child has made a contribution, it's like, oh, it's a really interesting connection. We added the language on. At a secondary level, in a math classroom, a student gets an idea and says, oh, that's a great conjecture. We add the more sophisticated language on to what the student is doing by noticing and naming. But noticing and naming goes beyond just talking about thinking, because as teachers, whatever we notice and name, we are reinforcing. Let me just say that again. As teachers, whatever we notice and name, we are reinforcing. And then you could ask yourself, well, what is it that teachers all over the world notice and name the most? I would say we notice and name correctness. You're right, that's it, you got it. You know, and then we shouldn't be surprised when our students come up to us. Is this right? Is this what you want? Is this what you're looking for? And we say, well, why can't they be more independent? All their lives, their teachers have been noticing and naming correctness. They're just asking you to notice and name their correctness. So, whatever we want to see more of in our classroom, we need to start noticing and naming. If you want to see more helpfulness, start noticing and naming helpfulness. If you want to see more cooperation, start noticing and naming that. If you want to see more reasoning, more justification, start noticing and naming that. Whatever we notice and name, we will be reinforcing for our students. This is also one of the reasons why new teachers are often warned against, you shouldn't notice and name bad behavior, because inadvertently you are drawing attention to it and you're reinforcing the idea that, if I misbehave, I get noticed. I get the attention that I'm after. So we notice and name the things we want as vehicles for reinforcing those. The next one, the language of community. This has to do with our choice of pronouns. So as teachers, do we talk about we, our, us? Or do we use more personal pronouns and more distancing pronouns? Well, I want you to do your job and your task. So we can use that, creating that sense of community through the we, our, us, or create more distance with I and you. And it's not that I and you are bad, it's not that you don't use them, because there are many instances in which that's absolutely what you need to be saying. It's more looking at those opportunities to use the we, our, and us. A person who's done a lot of research in this area, James Pennebaker at the University of Texas. And a few years ago, he wrote a book called The Secret Life of Pronouns. And in this book, which sounds like a really obscure linguistic text, it's actually on the New York Times bestseller list, because of all of the things that he was able to predict about people and organizations based on pronoun usage. So he developed software that he could just run text through and detect pronouns. He could run speech through and detect pronoun usage. And one of his first studies that he did is they went to businesses and organizations and they asked for access to their emails. He said, we don't want to read them, we just want to detect pronouns in emails. And that's what they did. Based on pronoun usage in emails, they could order people in an organization from who had the most power, who was at the top of the organization, to who was at the bottom rung of the organization. And what happens is people at the top use fewer personal pronouns, whereas people at the bottom have to use more. They did the same thing at the university. Based on pronoun usage, they could tell who was the professor and who was the student. And again, students use more personal pronouns than the professors. They looked at politicians' speeches, and they ran that through their software. A graph of pronoun usage in a politician's speeches revealed the ups and downs of their political career. So if you think about that, when would a politician have to use personal pronouns? When there's a scandal, Barnaby Joyce. When they have to talk about themselves. And as a politician, you're actually losing if you're talking about yourself. You know, there's a reason why Obama's slogan was, yes, we can. As a politician, you need to get people to affiliate with, we're in this together. You know, I'm with you, you're with me, and it's us, rather than it's about me and I. Very interesting study. They went to speed dating events. They could predict who was going to pair up in speed dating based on pronoun usage. And what happens, in the psychology behind that, is that when we are in sync with another human being, we tend to engage in some kind of mirroring behavior. So sometimes it's as simple as turning our bodies, sometimes it's as simple as using some similar gestures. And another thing that we do is we mirror pronoun usage. So when a couple began to mirror their pronoun usage, it was a good indication that they were likely to choose one another as potential dates, and sure enough, a good predictor. As a father, James Pennebaker was interested to find out, was his use of pronouns different with his son than with his daughter? So he wore a recording device, recorded all of his interactions with his son and daughter over the course of the week, and sure enough, it was different. With his daughter, he used more collective pronouns, we and our, and with the son, more I and you, and more distancing. Now, an interesting finding, and one of the things actually I read in the Wall Street Journal when James Pennebaker was being interviewed, is that a reporter said, well, obviously we, our, us is really significant, and so people should just start using it. And he said, well, it's harder than you think. He said, the whole reason why this line of research works is that as human beings, we don't think about our pronouns. When we talk, we think in terms of nouns and verbs, because they carry the meaning of our content. The pronouns just kind of slip out. So it comes from the fact that when we see ourselves as part of a group, we naturally use we and our. Another bit of related research, this wasn't from James Pennebaker, and I don't remember the names of the researchers there at the University of Wisconsin, who, for some 30 years have studied marriages. And can they predict and can they think about what are the things that cause couples, or indicators of potential conflict in relationships that might cause couples to divorce. And one of their best predictors, when they bring people in and just sit them down and have an interview with them and talk to them about their relationships, is their pronoun usage. You might think, well, marriage is a really complicated thing. How could pronoun usage, indicate that? Well, if you see yourself as part of the couple, you talk about we, our. When you've already distanced yourself from that person, you talk about she or he and I, and you create that distance. And so, sure enough, it's a good predictor for that. The next one is the language of identity. And this originally had its roots in the literacy movement. So all around the world, it's quite common, from even calling the youngest students readers, writers, authors. We have Readers and Writers Workshop, we have the Author's Chair, so we're really used to that language. Frank Smith and Lucy Hawkins and Don Graves, that's been popularized for a really long time. We are less likely in our schools to call our students mathematicians, scientists, geographers, historians. That language of identity, though, is significant in many ways, both for us as well as for our students. Because what the language of identity does is it changes our relationship to the subject. My colleague David Perkins says that one of the diseases that we have in schools is the disease of aboutitis. He says we teach about a lot of stuff. So when you come into math class and you learn about math, when you come to science class and you learn about science or about history, those things sit outside of you. But when you come into the science class and you are a scientist, you are a mathematician, you are a historian, it changes your relationship. No longer is this content that's being transferred to you, but you are engaging in the processes. As teachers, when we think about our students not as receptors of science information or historical information, but as historians, as scientists, we change the way that we teach as well. And for all children, the ability to try on different identities is a key part of their growing into adulthood. That they need to try on, what does this feel like? What is possible for me? And having that identity formation is really one of the key things I think that we do and help students with. A really powerful story about the language of identity. In the state of Virginia in the US, there was a juvenile detention center. And in this juvenile detention center, it was quite notorious in terms of it had a very high recidivism rate, meaning that once these young people were released, they soon found themselves back in prison within a few years, if not a few months. Because they were young people, they did still have to go to school, but the graduation rate was incredibly low, almost non-existent, and no one went on to university from that. So there was lots of things wrong. They revamped this whole thing. They built new buildings, new staff. So they did a lot of things. But one of the things they also did was they said, the way we refer to these young people will make a difference. Because if we don't want these young people to see themselves as criminals, as prisoners, as delinquents, we can't use that language with them. Because when we use that language, we are reinforcing the very identity we don't want them to have. So they decided, we will call these young people scholars. Now, if you are 15 years old and you find yourself in prison, chances are no one in your life has ever called you a scholar. So this was a big leap. And they recognized that this was not just how we referred to them when we're in their presence, but it's also when we are in the staff room. Because if in the staff room we call them delinquents, if in the staff room we call them prisoners and criminals, then we are reinforcing the very identity in our own minds that we don't want to communicate. Now that wasn't a silver bullet, but it was part of everything and that they were doing. And for the first time, they had students who, after they left, went on to university. The graduation rate greatly increased, and the recidivism rate dropped dramatically because they really worked hard using language of identity as part of what they were doing to make sure that these young people had a different identity. Now, these first three have very much to do with parts of speech, so the language of community, pronouns, identity nouns, and the language of noticing and naming, often the verbs. One last other very quick example of that language of identity before we move on. When I was working with a group of Catholic educators in Melbourne, one of the RE teachers said that a few years ago, he had started using the language of identity. He said it really transformed his RE classes, that the elementary students came in, and he referred to them as theologians. So now is not, we're learning about religion, we're learning the stories, we're just learning this information, and I'm going to tell you the same stories you've heard over and over again. But now we are acting as theologians, and so that really transformed the class, and the students were much more engaged. The next one here, so the first ones were very much parts of speech. These next ones are much more interactional and not just parts of speech. So the language of initiative has to do with the fact that in any instructional interaction with students, we can either encourage them being the active agents and initiators of their own learning, of their own problem solving, of their own thinking, or we can rescue. And the thing about rescuing is that from an adult perspective, rescuing always comes from a good place. It comes from a desire to be helpful. So a student has presented a problem, is having a challenge, is having difficulty, and we solve the problem for them. So it feels like we've been really helpful. However, the long-term consequence of that is that students that are constantly rescued develop what is called learned helplessness. So they have that lack of initiative, and they also learn to be masters at manipulating the adults in their lives, to to get other people to solve their problems for them. So in terms of developing that initiative, it means we need to be careful about rescuing. But it doesn't mean that we are unhelpful. It doesn't mean that we just pull back and we say, go and solve it yourself. What the language of initiative often sounds like is it sounds like a lot of questions. So we ask the person who has the problem, who's having the difficulty, questions which encourage their own thinking and then encourage their own decision making so we don't make the decisions for them. One way to know in any instructional interaction with a child if we are encouraging initiative or if we are rescuing is just to simply ask ourselves, in this moment, who is doing the thinking? If we are doing the thinking, we are probably rescuing. If we're encouraging the student to do his or her own thinking, then we're encouraging that sense of initiative. Another way that the language of initiative can show up in classrooms is it can also show up through silence. When we were at uni, most of us, when we were into training, one of the most common bits of research that is passed on to teachers early on in their career is about wait time. And so teachers are generally told, like, after you ask a question, wait a few seconds, more hands will go up, you'll get more elaborate responses. That is wait time 1, really important, because oftentimes people aren't told about wait time 2. And wait time 2 is how long we wait after a student has responded before we jump back in. And again, the research shows what we have a tendency to do, a student makes a comment, we jump right on top of it. We make a comment, we go on. And again, with wait time 2, what it shows is that if we hang back a few seconds, if we aren't so quick to intervene, the student continues. The student talks more. The student begins to elaborate, or another student jumps in. It's our present which actually is shutting down the discourse and the conversation and the thinking in some instances. One professional group that tends to be pretty good at this kind of wait time too are political reporters. Because political reporters, particularly print journalists, they know that when they ask a question of someone, a politician, the first thing out of a politician's mouth is a rehearsed response. That's what they were going to say anyway. And sometimes it's not even related to the question. But if the reporter doesn't jump on with the next question, if they just hang there, then once the politicians run out of their prepared remarks, that's when they say something interesting. And that's when they say something original. And that's when the real thinking, the real meaning kind of comes out. This next one, the language of knowing, comes from a researcher at Harvard. Her name is Ellen Langer, researcher in psychology. And she's someone that I worked with when I was a graduate student at Harvard. And for 40 years, Ellen Langer has developed a theory of mindfulness. I mean, mindfulness is a really hot topic all around the world, in education and in other fields. And what we often equate with mindfulness when we hear that word is the idea of a meditation, of focusing, of breathing, kind of quieting of the mind to focus and allow us to kind of go forward. Ellen Langer's theory is not the same thing as that, but it is very much related to that. What she looks at are what are the triggers that would cause our mind to be more mindful, more present, more aware, more alert, more creative, versus more mindless, more automatic, more trapped in kind of patterns of just automatic behavior. And one thing she looked at was she looked at language and what she calls absolute versus conditional language. So an absolute statement is, so I can say, this is a table. So that's an absolute statement. A conditional statement would be, well, this could be a table. Some people refer to that as a table. One use of that is as a table. All those are conditional statements. So is versus could be, might be. So her first study that she did was called the dog's chew toy study. And in most psychological experiments, the subjects in the experiment really don't know what the study is about. So subjects are coming into a room for an interview. And when they come into the room, sitting on the table is a rubber object. And sometimes the experimenter picks up this rubber object and says, this is a dog's chew toy, sits to their side. Other times the experimenter picks it up and says, this might be a dog's chew toy, sits to their side. Only difference in the experiment, this is versus this might be. Then the experimenter is conducting a survey, writing down all of the responses using a pencil, and makes a mistake. Says, I need to erase this. I don't have an eraser. The people that heard the rubber object might be a dog's chew toy thought to use that as an eraser, because that's all erasers are, rubber objects. But the people that heard this is a dog's chew toy did not think to use the rubber object as an eraser. So that one word is caused the mind to kind of close down to see that as fixed, and that one word might opened it up and allowed people to see it could be used in another way for something else. The study that I did with Ellen Langer, I'd been a maths teacher for years. I had lots of experience in my students in maths behaving quite mindlessly. And so I wanted to see if how this language played out in teaching of math. So for university students, I invented a mathematical procedure. And to one group of students, I showed them a method and said, this is how you solve this kind of problem. Showed them the method. To another group, I said, this is one way to solve this kind of problem. Showed them the exact same method. Then later gave them a test. The people that got the conditional instruction, this is one way, were more accurate on the test. They were less inclined to misapply the procedure in a situation where it didn't fit, and they were better in problem-solving situations. All with one little shift in words. And what I think is happening in that particular instance was, for many people, maths has never made sense. So as soon as I said, this is how you solve this problem, then they said, well, the goal of maths is always to do whatever the teacher shows you. So they shut down their thinking, tried to memorize this procedure, even though it didn't make sense. And as soon as I said, this is one way, those people were able to bring all of their mathematical knowledge, and this procedure only required you to understand place value, so not a very complicated thing for university students, and they could bring all their mathematical knowledge to understand what was happening with this concept and with this procedure, and then be much more effective. When these studies came out, one of the criticisms were, yeah, but there are facts in the world, and there are things that people need to know, and there are absolutes and all that. And that wasn't Ellen Langer's point. The Ellen Langer point wasn't to turn everything too much. It was like, no, it's about the flexibility and ability to use the information in a flexible way, the ability to keep our minds open. So to prove her point, she looked at a civil engineering exam. So in civil engineering, you have to know the rules and regulations of civil engineering and how to apply those rules and regulations. So she rewrote the study guide. One group of people got the absolute study guide, so they were just learning the rules and regulations, this is. Another group got a conditional study guide, could be, might be. When it came time for the test, no difference in the recall of information. So conditional language doesn't interfere at all with the learning of facts. When it came time for application, the group that got the conditional study guide were much better. And that was her point, that having that conditional language allows us to make connections, allows us to see how information gets used and might be used in different ways rather than being very narrow. The last study that I wanted to share with you was one by another colleague of mine, Daniel Wilson at Harvard. And Daniel studies how adults learn in groups. And one of the things he studied several years ago was he studied a sporting event called the Eco Challenge. This is a sporting event where teams of adults, 5 people on each team, they are dropped somewhere in the world. And they have to get from point A to point B over the course of a week. They ford streams, they climb mountains, they have to orienteer, they're given a map, they get lost. Sleeping is optional in this event. Most people, 75% of people report hallucinating. This is a race. Another fact of the race is you can't send out scouts. You have to operate as a team. If one member of your team is more than 50 meters away, your team is disqualified. So people have to stay together. When you interview people at the beginning, because many teams compete year after year, about what makes a winning team, most people have said, well, you know what? The winning teams just get lost a whole lot less, because that would kind of make sense. You're on a race, and if you don't get lost, you seem like, well, that's a clear advantage. And it would be, but that's not the case. Winning teams get lost just as much as losing teams. So this is filmed, sporting events filmed for ESPN. So Daniel had all the footage, and he analyzed what happens when winning and losing teams get lost, and do they behave differently? And what he found, well, they do behave differently. And they behave differently in terms of their use of absolute and conditional language. When a losing team gets lost, they use 70% absolute language versus 30% conditional. When a winning team gets lost, it's exactly the reverse. They use 70% conditional language versus 30% absolute. So what that sounds like is a losing team member is most likely to say, we've been here before, we need to go that way. Whereas a winning team member is more likely to say, I think maybe we've been here before. I think we might need to go that way. You kind of hear the difference there. What is happening is when people hear that absolute language, it's almost like they're prepared for an argument. They're prepared for a fight. These people are tired. They just go along. Whereas when the person uses the conditional language, they're actually inviting you to share your information. Winning teams got unlost more effectively because more people shared information. And that gave them the tools to move forward. And we actually see a very similar thing happen in classroom discussions. When people are using conditional language, it's very easy for other people to enter in. When people are using absolute language, it's much harder. So when a student says, oh, the answer's, then every other student has to say, well, am I going to disagree with that student? And some students have no problem with disagreeing, but a lot of students won't. They'll shut down. But when that student says, I think it might be, it's much easier for another student to contribute. And we don't necessarily need to teach our students conditional language. That what happens is that when we use conditional language, the students will mirror back our language. So if we say, what is the answer? They will say the answer is. If we say, what might the answer be? They'll say, I think it might be. So they will mirror us. So even if a student does use absolute language, we can say, John thinks the answer might be. So we can rephrase it in terms of the conditional. The next one here is the language of feedback and praise. And lots of people have written about this. So Dylan, William, and Paul Black from the UK have been real kind of pioneers in the field of understanding the role of feedback. Hattie's research shows that feedback is one of the most important things that we do as teachers to move kind of learning forward. And Dylan, William, and Paul Black's research, they show that the important things about feedback is that feedback has to be specific rather than general. It can't be great job, well done. It needs to be very specific. It needs to be sincere, and it needs to be action-oriented. Their research also showed, by and large, students don't make use of feedback. Students don't really appreciate feedback. And part of the reason for that is students tend to view feedback as behind them. I'm already done with that. And Dylan, William, and Paul Black said that what we need to do is we need to feed forward. And that makes it action-oriented. We give feedback only on things where there is a chance to revise and go forward. That's how we can use feedback or feed forward there. There is a connection there in terms of being specific and the language of noticing and naming. So when we are specific, we are noticing and naming the very specific features of what students have done that they can repeat, that they can improve, that they can do, rather than those general comments. In terms of praise, Carol Dweck's work on the growth mindset thinks that we need to make sure and avoid actually praising students' ability. You're so smart, you're so clever, you're just good at this, you're just a natural. That when we praise ability, we are praising the ego. And then what students do is they engage in ego protection. And two ways that students will engage in ego protection is they will avoid challenges, because this adult just thinks I'm really clever. So if I fail at this next task, they're not going to think I'm clever, so I won't do it. So they avoid challenge, do things that are simple, or they cheat. And cheating is kind of rampant in schools, particularly about secondary students, and it's one way also when students feel that pressure to perform for an adult. I don't want an adult to think less of me, whether it be a parent or whether it be a teacher, then cheating tends to go kind of way up. When we praise effort, we give students something that can be repeated, and they're actually more likely to take on challenge. So when we tell them what they did, what they can do next time, what they can carry forward, and Carol Dweck has been clear that praising effort is not, good job, you worked really hard, better luck next time. That's not helpful. that you need to give students very specific learning-focused feedback about what they did and what they can do next time. And the last one here, the language of listening. So the language of listening, similar to the language of initiative, it's not about being silent, although of course we do have to make sure that we are present, that our students can tell that we are interested in what they're doing, that all of our students, unless they're on the autism spectrum, have the ability to read nano expressions, because we do as human beings. We can tell instantly, is this adult really listening to us? And students can tell. And they can tell, is this adult really interested in what I have to say, in my thinking, in my ideas, or is the game here, guess what's in the teacher's head? And they will play guess what's in the teacher's head. So we do have to be present, we have to kind of show that we're interested, but real listening often takes the form, again, of a lot of questioning. Because when we're listening to someone, we probe them, we want to hear more, we uncover more about what they're doing. So it's not just about being silent, but it's being present and asking questions that begin to kind of pull that person out further. So on these last four, again, not just parts of speech, but much more interactional in nature, could you turn to your partners again and talk about kind of what's coming up for you, what are you finding interesting as you think about these in relationship to your own teaching?